talked about Mercury and Venus and Earth and the Moon, so let's talk about Mars now. The red planet, it's called. Really, it looks more orange to me, but it's called the red planet, and so that's because of the coloration of it. We now know the coloration is due to iron oxides, basically like rust on the surface. So this is like the red soil we have on Earth. As Mars orbits the Sun, the sidereal period, the time it takes to go around, 687 days. But remember, Earth's moving as well. And so that means the synodic period, how long it really takes to go from opposition to opposition, 780 days. So that's almost 2 years. So that means that you see Mars in the sky about every 2 years. Now, it's not always as good of a view as other times. So sometimes when Earth is near its aphelion and Mars is near its perihelion, then when they have an opposition, they're very, very close. But if Earth is near its aphelion, or perihelion rather, and Mars is near its aphelion, then you see Mars, even at opposition, when it's normally close, it can be like twice as far away as it is when it's up close to us. 2003, in August 2003, was an exceptionally close opposition. It was, in fact, it was the closest opposition in tens of thousands of years. Now, that was only like minutely closer than other times. But what happens is that Mars is actually at a really, really close opposition about every 15, 16 years or so. And so about every decade and a half, then Mars has these ultra close oppositions. And then that's long enough in between that people tend to forget. And so when it has another really close opposition, it's this really big bright thing in the sky, and people kind of forget about that. This is a graphic showing oppositions, from 2012 to 2027, so about a 15-year cycle there. And 2020 was an extremely close opposition, and so we had extremely close opposition at 2020. 2022 pretty close. Is not going to be as it was not going to be as close. So there's a variety of things here. Okay, the most recent opposition was actually October of this year, and so October of this year we had opposition. That's why Mars is actually big and bright out there. The next opposition is close as the one in 2003. So the 2020 was not quite as close. There was a particularly that was close. It's not super close. The next one as close is going to be in August of 2050, in which case Mars will be 0.374 AU. Now, why is that significant? Well, that means that at that time, August of 2050, Mars will be especially large in small amateur telescopes. But Mars is very small. You could fit 8 Marses inside of Earth. And so Mars is a very tiny little world. And so it's a long ways away. I mean, it is over a third of an AU away most of the time, and usually longer than that. Closest is about a third of an AU, and usually it's much, much farther than that. And so it's very small. It can get much, much farther away than Mercury or Venus to us, and so it's always a difficult target to see. And so it typically, like when you look in a telescope, you're trying to look at this little tiny thing, and then turbulence in Earth's atmosphere makes it drift in and out of focus all the time. And so as it drifts in and out of focus, it's very difficult to see details. It is very small and very far away, but astronomers did notice that it had bright and dark markings on it. And by measuring those bright and dark markings as they move across the surface, they were able to figure out at least that it rotates, and it's tilted on its axis as it rotates, and bright and dark spots appear at the north and south poles, and they grow bigger in the wintertime. So that suggests ice caps. So there's a variety of things here about Mars that are of some interest to us. Christiaan Huygens, back in the 1600s, made the very first measurements of the rotation of Mars by noticing it had bright and dark spots. And he just measured how long it took the bright and dark spots to go around, and he figured out that Mars rotates in about the same time that Earth does, just maybe a little bit longer. Modern measurements indicate that it rotates every 24 hours, 37 minutes, and 22 seconds. Remember, Earth rotates every 23 hours and 56 minutes and 4 seconds. So Mars rotates only slightly longer than does Earth. So about 40 minutes longer than Earth, a day on Mars. We call it a sol on Mars. So a sol is 1 day on Mars, 1 Martian day. Mars's rotation is tilted about 25 degrees. That's real close to Earth's 23.5 degrees. And so as that tilt on Earth causes seasons on Earth, the tilt on Mars causes seasons on Mars. And we can actually see that there are seasonal variations. So Mars holds this special place in observations in that those kind of observations made Mars look very Earth-like. Angelo Secchi, actually a very famous astronomer in his own right, was also someone who was very keen on studying Mars. He studied a lot of variable stars, but he also studied Mars. And he made the first maps of Mars showing some bright and dark markings. Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was so instrumental in mistakenly determining the rotation rate of Mercury, also made maps of Mars. And he believed that the bright and dark markings were due to water. He thought the dark markings were maybe seas. Now, Schiaparelli also was pushing his telescopes to extreme, and Mars was drifting in and out of focus. Now, there's a very interesting thing that happens. It's sort of an optical illusion that happens when things drift in and out of focus like that, and you just get bare whispers of views about, for about a second or so at a time. Your brain tries to fill in the gaps of what your eye didn't see. And this is something that's been demonstrated in the classroom, in the laboratory. You show somebody these random blobs, and you just show it to them for a flash and ask what they saw, and they instinctively seem to think they're straight lines connecting things. And so Schiaparelli thought he saw straight lines connecting these dark things, which he thought were seas. And so those lines weren't really there, but he thought he saw them. And of course, since they were optical illusion, they looked a little bit different every time he looked. So he was thinking that the lines came and went. And the only way he could think of that happening is if Mars was like a desert world and water was flowing down channels between one part of Mars and another. So he calls these channels in Italian, which is canali. And so here we have the idea that Mars has these channels. The idea they were working with at the time was, incorrectly, that Mars would have been habitable first, then Earth, then Venus. And so they were looking at Venus. They were starting to realize that Venus was covered in clouds. They mistakenly thought that that meant that Venus was a very wet, watery world. Earth has some clouds and lots of oceans, so they thought that, and Mars, we didn't see oceans, we just saw some of these dark regions what they thought were like small drying up seas. And so they actually had the idea that planets get drier as they age. And so as water would flow through a desert, you would have vegetation that suddenly start growing. And so that's what Schiaparelli thought was happening on Mars. Now, the problem is that word, canali. Okay, it means channels. But a very wealthy American businessman by the name of Percival Lowell mistranslated canali. And he thought that it meant canals. Now, there's a huge difference between canal and channel. A channel, like the Grand Canyon, or a river channel, or something of that sort, is a naturally occurring sort of thing. A canal, like the Panama Canal, the Erie Canal, the Suez Canal, that's actually artificial. So this suggested to Lowell that Mars had a civilization on it, alive. Now, that idea really was not totally revolutionary because remember, people were mistakenly thinking that we had Earth. Mars was older, and therefore is the way Earth will be in millions of years, and Venus is the way Earth was millions of years ago. And so the idea was, well, if you have dinosaurs, then people, and so they thought there were dinosaurs on Venus, and then people on Earth, and then whatever people evolved into on Mars. And so this idea really seemed to fit with what some people were thinking at the time. And so what he did was he spent an enormous amount of money, became sort of an amateur astronomer, and built a very large observatory, Lowell Observatory, right near Flagstaff in Arizona. Lowell Observatory turned out to be the world's largest private observatory, and it still is, and it still does major astronomical research, first-class research for that matter. Lowell insisted that they study Mars extensively, and the problem was that even though they had some of the best telescopes in America, nobody but Lowell actually saw canals on Mars. There's now actually speculation that what was happening was that he had an optical condition that when you shine on his eye with the sort of red light that you get Mars, he was seeing the blood vessels in his retina. And so that's why he kept mapping the same features every time he looked at Mars. And so that's just speculation. We don't know that for sure, but he did have, he was about the only one who saw through his telescopes the canals on Mars. Now, here's the thing. It's not canals, but the public opinion, because the newspapers kept reporting canals and Lowell's work, and they were fueling the idea of Martians. Okay. Canals that has distinct connotations, Martians. That idea really went over because what happened was Herbert George Wells, H.G. Wells, beginning of the century, wrote a novel about Martians coming to Earth. The idea being that Mars was an older world, and the advanced civilization was dying because Mars was drying up, and so they came to Earth, which was a wet world, and they invaded Earth. And his book, they attacked London. Okay. In 1939, there was a radio program called Mercury Theater on the Air, starring a fellow like Orson Welles, no relation to H.G. Wells. And this was like a radio theater, radio program. They did dramatizations of things, and they decided to do a dramatization of the War of the Worlds. And so what happened was, though, they made it sound like it was a real attack. Well, they were airing right opposite of a sort of really famous radio program, talent show. And during the first commercial break, people, started listening around, and they tuned in to the Mercury Theater, and they heard about Martians attacking New Jersey, and these giant tripods marching across New Jersey. In fact, what happened was people panicked, and there was a huge hysteria about this. In fact, people in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, where the Martians supposedly were, packed into pickup trucks with guns, went to downtown to protect the city, and they saw a giant Martian tripod standing over the city, and they started shooting at it and started squirting water at them. Next morning, the water department was trying to figure out why there were all these bullet holes in the water tower. And in fact, in the story, the radio program, the Martians were marching towards New York, and there was a mass panic of people trying to get out of New York. Okay. Now, reality is there was no Martian attack, and there are no Martians. Okay. So, but it was a very cool story, and went on to be a couple of major movies, a TV show, a Broadway musical, all kind of things. War of the Worlds. Okay, and so it is a really interesting story. Okay, and of course, real Martians are nothing like that.